What if Apple's most ambitious iPhone almost became a supply chain disaster before customers could even buy it? In 2017, Apple wasn't just launching another iPhone. It was betting the future of the iPhone on technologies it had never used at this scale. A nearly bezel-less OLED display, a completely new facial recognition system, and a tiny collection of sensors hidden inside one controversial notch. The phone would cost $999. But the real price Apple risked paying wasn't measured in dollars. It was measured in time. Because behind the scenes, Apple was fighting a supply chain war against the clock. And the strangest part? One of the biggest threats came from Samsung, Apple's fiercest smartphone rival. When Apple unveiled the iPhone X in September 2017, it was presented as the future of the smartphone. It had a radically redesigned body. The familiar home button was gone. The screen stretched almost from edge to edge, and for the first time on an iPhone, Apple introduced an OLED display. But this wasn't just a technical upgrade. It was a massive manufacturing challenge. Apple had designed a phone that depended on several components that were either completely new to the iPhone or extremely difficult to manufacture at scale. And the stakes were enormous. The iPhone X started at $999 in the United States, an unprecedented price for a mainstream iPhone at the time. Apple had to convince customers that this wasn't simply another upgrade. It had to feel like the future. And that meant the supply chain had to deliver something it had never delivered before. Then came Apple's first major problem, the OLED display. At the time, Samsung Display was essentially the only supplier capable of producing the type of flexible OLED panels Apple needed at the required scale and quality. And that created an extraordinary situation. Apple and Samsung were fierce competitors in the smartphone market. They had spent years fighting over patents and market share. Yet Apple needed Samsung to help build its most important new iPhone. Industry estimates at the time put the cost of the iPhone X's OLED display module at roughly $110 per phone. That meant one of Apple's greatest competitors had enormous leverage over one of Apple's most important components. Think about the irony. Apple was trying to build the world's most advanced iPhone. But part of that future depended on a company trying to beat Apple in the smartphone business. And Samsung wasn't the end of Apple's problems. It was only the beginning. Look closely at the top of the iPhone X. That notch wasn't simply a design decision. It was a miniature technological battlefield. Apple had removed the home button, so it needed a completely new way to authenticate users. The answer was Face ID. And Face ID depended on Apple's TrueDepth camera system. The system used several components to map the user's face in 3 dimensions. One of the most important pieces was the dot projector. It projected thousands of invisible infrared dots onto a person's face. The infrared camera then captured that pattern. The phone used the resulting depth information to recognize the user. It sounds simple when you experience it, but manufacturing it was anything but simple, because all of those components had to work together with extraordinary precision. And that's where the story gets interesting. Inside Apple's supply chain, 2 components reportedly became infamous. They were nicknamed Romeo and Juliet. Romeo was the dot projector. Juliet was the infrared camera, and the two had to work together with extraordinary precision. The problem wasn't necessarily creating one working unit. The problem was creating millions of them reliably enough for a global smartphone launch. Reports in 2017 indicated that production problems involving the TrueDepth system were creating a serious bottleneck. Some components were taking longer to manufacture and assemble than expected. And when one component falls behind in a tightly synchronized production system, something strange happens. Everything else can be ready. The displays can be ready. The processors can be ready. The frames can be ready. The batteries can be ready. But if one critical sensor isn't ready, the phone isn't ready. That is the hidden weakness of modern manufacturing. The value of the final product can be enormous, but the entire system can still depend on something almost invisible. And Apple didn't have unlimited time. The company had already announced that the iPhone X would be available for pre-order on October 27th and would reach stores on November 3rd. That schedule was critical because Apple was entering the holiday shopping season with the most expensive mainstream iPhone it had ever launched. Every day of delay meant fewer phones available, and fewer phones meant frustrated customers. So Apple had a decision. Do you delay the product, or do you fix the manufacturing problem while the clock is already running? Apple chose the second option. And this is where the supply chain became the real story. Apple's supply chain operation was already one of the most sophisticated in the world, but the iPhone X pushed that system to its limits. Engineers and suppliers had to work through manufacturing problems involving the new technologies. The objective wasn't simply to design a component that worked. It was to make that component repeatably and economically at enormous volume. That distinction is everything. A laboratory can produce a handful of perfect components. A global smartphone launch requires millions. Every improvement in manufacturing yield could translate into thousands more usable components. The goal was simple: get more working sensors out of the same production process, because Apple didn't need a technological demonstration. It needed millions of finished iPhones. The pressure eventually became visible to consumers. The iPhone 8 and iPhone 8 Plus went on sale in September. The iPhone X came later. Apple officially announced that the X would be available for pre-order on October 27th and in stores on November 3rd. And when it finally arrived, demand immediately overwhelmed available supply. Shipping estimates quickly stretched into weeks for many customers. So the iPhone X wasn't canceled. Apple didn't lose the product. But the launch exposed something much more uncomfortable. Even Apple couldn't simply command a complex global supply chain to move faster. And here's the part most people miss. The iPhone X crisis wasn't really about one bad supplier. It wasn't simply about Samsung. And it wasn't simply about Face ID. It was about dependency. Apple had designed an extraordinary product, but every revolutionary feature created another manufacturing dependency. OLED created one challenge. TrueDepth created another. The tiny sensors created another. And all of those dependencies had to converge at exactly the right moment. That's the paradox of modern technology. The more advanced the product becomes, the more fragile the path to mass production can become. And that's why the iPhone X matters far beyond Apple. Because this is how the modern technology industry really works. You can have the world's best engineers, the world's strongest brand, billions of dollars, millions of customers waiting. But if one critical component can't be produced fast enough, everything stops. Apple eventually got the iPhone X into customers' hands, and the product became enormously influential, helping establish the $1,000 plus premium smartphone category and making technologies like Face ID, OLED central to Apple's future. But the lesson was bigger than the phone itself. Innovation doesn't end when you invent something. It ends when you can manufacture it. So the next time you look at a billion-dollar product, don't just ask, who designed it? Ask, who can actually manufacture every tiny piece of it? Because the world's biggest companies aren't always defeated by their biggest competitors. Sometimes, they're held hostage by the smallest part of the product. And that is the hidden power of the supply chain. Follow Behind the Billion for more stories about the hidden forces behind the world's biggest companies.